You hear the name Bill Gates, and you probably think you know the story, right? Microsoft, philanthropy, one of the richest people in the world. But his brand new memoir, Source Code, it promises to show us something else entirely. The guy he was before he became an icon. So let's get into it and see what the story is all about. So, right at the start of the book, Gates hits us with this quote from the physicist Richard Feynman, and it's just the perfect way to frame his life, which has always been driven by this intense curiosity. Just the absolute joy of figuring something out. The whole book is really built around that idea. And that right there is the real heart of this memoir. It's not just about the thrill of figuring out a machine. It's about a young Bill Gates trying to figure out, well, himself, who he was, and where he was supposed to fit in the world. So here's how we're going to break it down. We'll look at the man before Microsoft, this wild story about coding in the mountains, the absolutely critical partnership he formed at Lakeside School, the single magazine issue that changed everything, the birth of his company, and finally, what this book really tells us about him. Okay, so let's start with the big question. Who was Bill Gates before, Bill Gates? Before the billions, before Windows was on every desk? Who is this kid from Seattle? Yeah, the book really zeroes in on this specific chunk of his life. We're talking his early childhood, his rebellious school days, right up through his time at Harvard and that pivotal moment he and Paul Allen decide to go for it. It really is the origin story. All right, one of the coolest parts of the book is right at the beginning. He tells us one story that honestly tells you almost everything you need to know about him as a teenager and the two different worlds he lived in. And it really boils down to this clash of two worlds living inside his head. On one side, you've got Bill the hiker. He's out there in the wild, physically challenged, kind of just following the group. But on the other, you have Bill the programmer. In that world, a world of pure logic, he felt totally limitless. He was the leader, no question. And this one specific memory just pulls it all together perfectly. He's on a totally miserable, freezing cold 20-mile hike. He gets outvoted by his friends and has to keep going. So to escape, he just checks out. He retreats into his own head. And for hours, while his body is trudging through the mountains, his mind is writing code, a formula evaluator, for a computer back at school. He says it was the cleanest, most perfect code he'd ever conceived. Now, that incredible focus, a lot of that started at his school, Lakeside. This is where a few lucky breaks and one very important friendship really set the entire stage for what was to come. I mean, you have to remember how incredibly rare this was. It's 1968. Most people had never even seen a computer. But there at his school, Gates and his friend Paul Allen are getting hands-on time. They went from a simple teletype to a massive mainframe. And eventually, they even bought their own microprocessor chip for $360, which is like over $2,000 today. Unbelievable access for a couple of teenagers. And this wasn't just them messing around for fun. No way. They started the Lakeside Programming Group and began taking on actual paying jobs. They wrote a payroll system for a company. They even wrote the software that scheduled classes for their own school. They were basically teenage professionals running a small business before they could even drive. Okay, so fast forward a bit. Gates is at Harvard, and you can just feel the buzz in the air. The pieces for a personal computer revolution were all there. It just needed a spark. And that spark was about to land on a magazine rack. See, Intel had just dropped this new chip, the 8080. It was powerful enough to be the brains of a real, honest-to-God computer for the average person. Everybody in the know knew something big was about to happen. The race was on. And then, bam, this happens. A company out in New Mexico called MITS announces the Altair 8800. It was a kit, and it cost less than $400. Suddenly, a regular person, a hobbyist, could afford to own a computer. This changed everything. This right here, this is the lightning strike moment. Paul Allen sees this magazine cover in Harvard Square, grabs it, and literally runs to find Gates. He knew the Altair was the future, but it had a huge problem. It had no software. It was a box of lights. This was their chance. And here's the wild part. They didn't even have an Altair to work with. So they used Harvard's giant computer to write a program that would pretend to be an Altair. Gates reached back in his memory and pulled out that perfect code he wrote in his head on that hike. And then, and this is the craziest part, they called the company, MITS, and told them they had a working version of the basic programming language for the Altair. They were totally bluffing. They had nothing yet. And guess what? The bluff worked. MIT's told them to fly out to New Mexico for a demo. This kicked off a mad scramble to actually finish the software and, well, start a company. So they called their new partnership Microsoft. Pretty straightforward, right? Microcomputer, software. They even used a hyphen back then, which is kind of funny to think about now. Gates dropped out of Harvard for good, and they packed their bags for Albuquerque. But look, it wasn't all smooth sailing. Not even close. It was a total trial by fire. Right away, people started pirating their software. Their business dealings with MITS got super heated. And on top of all that, they had to actually figure out how to run a business, hire their friends, and just deal with the complete chaos of a startup. Okay, so let's pull back for a second. What's the big takeaway from this memoir? What are people saying about this surprisingly open look into his early life? You know, the interesting thing is the reviews are all kind of saying the same thing. The Guardian calls it refreshingly frank. The Wall Street Journal says it's unexpectedly revealing. It seems like everyone was struck by the honesty and the details that really paint a picture of a person, not a caricature. And you gotta remember, this is just Act 1. He's planning 2 more books. The next one is gonna cover the Microsoft years, the explosive growth, the controversies, all of it. And the third will be about his work in philanthropy. So this book gives us the source code, right? The blueprint of the young, brilliant, obsessive kid. But it really leaves you wondering, how are the next 2 books going to handle the much messier, more complicated parts of his story as he goes from building an empire to trying to fix the world?